What if I told you that a Mexican drug cartel dressed up like medieval knights, performed blood rituals, and got taken down by angry farmers armed with hunting rifles and a chocolate birthday cake? You think you know cartel stories, ruthless bosses, billion-dollar empires, government corruption, but this one's different. Meet the Knights Templar Cartel, a cult-like criminal organization that ruled an entire Mexican state, preached about protecting the poor while terrorizing them, and collapsed in the most spectacular way possible. Today, we're diving into their twisted origins, their reign of terror, and the satisfying downfall that proved even the most powerful cartels can fall when regular people say, enough. This is the story of the Knights Templar Cartel, and trust me, it's one you won't forget. Before we get into the madness, let me break it down for you. We're going to cover how a splinter group from La Familia Michoacana became Mexico's most bizarre cartel, the cult-like rituals where members dressed as medieval knights and swore blood oaths, and the reign of terror from 2011 to 2013, where they extorted everyone from avocado farmers to tortilla sellers. We'll talk about the moment ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, and taxi drivers said, "No more," and grabbed their guns. And we'll get into the spectacular collapse that saw their leaders killed one by one, with the final boss caught because his girlfriend ordered him a birthday cake. Yeah, you heard that right. A birthday cake. Let's get into it. To understand the Knights Templar, you gotta understand where they came from. The story starts with La Familia Michoacana, one of Mexico's most violent cartels that emerged in the mid-2000s in the state of Michoacán. La Familia wasn't your typical drug cartel. They had this whole pseudo-religious thing going on, led by a guy named Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, who everyone called El Chayo, or El Mas Loco, which means the craziest one. El Chayo was something else, fam. He wrote his own Bible, preached about divine justice, and positioned La Familia as protectors of the people against rival cartels like Los Zetas. The guy literally published his own religious texts, distributing them throughout Michoacán like some kind of narco-prophet. His writings mixed Catholic imagery with street philosophy, creating this weird hybrid ideology that resonated with poor communities who felt abandoned by both the government and the church. But here's the thing about cartels that claim they're protecting people. They're usually lying. La Familia extorted businesses, kidnapped rivals, and committed the same atrocities they claimed to be fighting against. They'd roll into towns, execute suspected Zetas members in public, and then demand loyalty and money from the locals they'd just saved. It was Protection Racket 101, just wrapped in religious language and pseudo-moral justification. By 2010, the Mexican government was closing in. President Felipe Calderón had made the drug war his signature issue, deploying thousands of troops across Mexico. Michoacán became a major battleground, with the military conducting raids and operations throughout the state. The heat was on, and La Familia's leadership knew their days were numbered if they didn't adapt. On December 9, 2010, the Mexican government announced they'd killed Nazario Moreno in a shootout. The official story was that El Chayo died in a two-day gun battle with federal forces in the town of Apatzingán. President Felipe Calderón celebrated it as a major victory, one of the biggest wins in his drug war. Press conferences, congratulations all around, government officials patting themselves on the back for taking down one of Mexico's most wanted men. There was just one problem. El Chayo wasn't actually dead. No body was ever recovered. The government claimed the cartel had taken it, which seemed convenient. But we'll get back to that later, because that fake death created a power vacuum. And from that chaos, something even more twisted was born. After El Chayo's alleged death, some of La Familia's top leaders had a decision to make. The cartel was fracturing under government pressure and internal disputes. Different factions were fighting for control. Rivals were moving in, trying to take advantage of the chaos. They needed to rebrand, reorganize, and come back stronger. They needed a new identity that would rally their troops and intimidate their enemies. So in March 2011, a group of La Familia's co-founders, including Servando La Tuta, Gomez Martinez, Dionisio Loya Plancarte, and the Montes brothers, formed a new organization. They called themselves the Caballeros Templarios, the Knights Templar. Yeah, like the actual medieval Catholic military order from the Crusades, the warrior monks who fought in the Holy Land and became legends of European history. These guys weren't playing around with the branding. They went all in on the night aesthetic, positioning themselves as a self-defense movement, protecting Michoacan from bigger, more violent cartels. They claimed they were different from other criminal organizations, noble, honorable, guided by a code of ethics. They said they were fighting for the people, not against them. They promised to bring order to a state that had been torn apart by cartel violence. Spoiler alert, they weren't any of those things. But the branding was genius, you gotta give them that. In a country exhausted by cartel violence, the idea of criminals with a code, with rules, with some kind of moral compass was appealing. People wanted to believe that someone could bring order, even if that someone was technically a criminal organization. Here's where it gets wild. The Knights Templar created their own 22-page rulebook called The Code of the Knights Templar of Michoacan. This thing was decorated with images of knights on horseback, lances, crosses, the whole medieval fantasy. It looked like something out of a history book or a fantasy novel, not a cartel manual. The production value alone showed how seriously they took this image. The code laid out rules for members. They had to help the poor and helpless, fight against materialism, respect women and children, never kill for money, and never use drugs. They even drug-tested their own members to make sure everyone stayed clean. Members were supposed to live by these principles, to be warriors with honor, soldiers with a cause beyond just making money. The code also included specific instructions on how members should conduct themselves. They were told to dress modestly, avoid flashy displays of wealth, and always be respectful to civilians. They were supposed to be the opposite of the stereotypical cartel member, the guy with gold chains and expensive cars. The Knights Templar wanted to present themselves as humble servants of the people, modern-day Robin Hoods who just happened to be heavily armed. On paper, it sounds almost noble, right? But in reality, it was all propaganda, a way to control their operatives and justify their violence as some kind of holy mission. The code gave members a sense of purpose beyond just criminal enterprise. It made them feel like they were part of something bigger, something meaningful. It was cult indoctrination disguised as a moral framework. The Knights Templar didn't just recruit members, they indoctrinated them. New recruits went through week-long courses studying the writings of Nazario Moreno, who was supposedly dead but whose philosophy still guided the organization. These weren't just training camps where you learned how to use weapons and move drugs. These were ideological boot camps where you learned the Knights Templar worldview. Recruits would spend hours each day reading El Chayo's writings, discussing his philosophy, and learning the code. They'd be tested on their knowledge, quizzed on the principles, made to memorize passages. It was like a twisted seminary school for criminals. The instructors would explain how the Knights Templar were different from other cartels, how they had a higher purpose, how they were the good guys in a world full of bad guys. At the end of the course, something straight out of a movie would happen. El Chayo himself would appear, dressed in white robes, looking like some kind of prophet. Remember, the world thought he was dead, but here he was, appearing to new recruits like some kind of resurrected messiah. He was dressed as God, one former member recalled. The psychological impact of seeing this supposedly dead legend appear before you, dressed in religious garments, speaking about your sacred mission, must have been intense. The initiation ritual included dressing up like medieval knights and performing blood pacts. Blood pacts. New members would cut their hands or arms, mixing their blood with other members, swearing loyalty to the organization and to each other. Some reports described elaborate ceremonies where members wore actual knight costumes, complete with helmets and armor, standing in circles while leaders read from the code. These weren't just criminals. They were building a cult with guns, drugs, and a twisted sense of divine purpose. And for a while, it worked. The Knights Templar attracted thousands of members, many of them true believers who thought they were joining something noble. Young men from poor communities saw the Knights Templar as a way to have purpose, to be part of something bigger than themselves, to be warriors instead of just another struggling farmer or laborer. Every cartel needs a face, and for the Knights Templar, that face was Servando La Tuta Gomez Martinez. La Tuta's story is wild on its own. This guy wasn't some lifelong criminal who grew up in the drug trade. He was a school teacher. Yeah, a teacher. As recently as early 2010, he was still registered as a teacher in Michoacan. earning a salary of 50,000 pesos, which is about $2,500 a month. He taught at a primary school, standing in front of kids, teaching them math and reading. But somewhere along the way, Tuta went from teaching kids to leading one of Mexico's most ruthless cartels. The transformation is fascinating and terrifying. Some reports say he got involved with La Familia Michoacana through family connections. Others say he was recruited because of his intelligence and charisma. Whatever the path, by 2011 he was one of the top leaders of the Knights Templar, the public face of the organization. And he had his own quirks that made him stand out even in the weird world of Mexican cartels. Tuta was known for using tarot cards to make decisions, like literally pulling cards to decide whether to murder someone or which organizations to target. He'd lay out the cards, study them, and make life or death decisions based on what he saw. Imagine being interrogated by a cartel boss who's shuffling a deck of tarot cards to decide your fate. That's the type of energy Tuta brought to the game. But Tuta was also smart, charismatic, and media savvy in a way most cartel leaders weren't. He understood public relations. He knew how to work a crowd, how to give interviews, how to present himself as a man of the people, rather than a ruthless criminal. He'd call into radio shows, give interviews to journalists, and even hold impromptu press conferences. He was building a brand, crafting an image of the benevolent outlaw. Remember how the government said they killed El Chayo in 2010? Yeah, that was a lie, or a mistake, or both. Despite President Calderon's claims, Nazario Moreno was still alive and running the Knights Templar from the shadows. For over 3 years, while the government celebrated his death, El Chayo was hiding in the mountains of Michoacán, still leading the organization, still writing his manifestos, still appearing to new recruits in his white robes. Commissioner Alfredo Castillo later admitted, the main beneficiary of his anonymity was El Chayo because he was still able to lead the criminal organization. Think about that. The government's false claim of killing him actually made him more powerful. He could operate without the intense scrutiny that comes with being a known cartel leader. He became a ghost, a legend, a myth. And myths are harder to fight than men. So while the world thought he was dead, El Chayo was pulling strings, writing more pseudo-religious manifestos, and building his legend. He'd move between safe houses in the mountains, always surrounded by loyal guards, always one step ahead of authorities. He continued to guide the Knights Templar strategy, approve major operations, and maintain his role as the spiritual leader of the organization. And the people of Michoacán? They started worshiping him. In the region of Apatzingan, locals created altars with statues and photos of El Chayo. They prayed to him, calling him Saint Nazario. People would light candles, leave offerings, and ask for his intercession in their problems. A drug lord, a saint. That's the level of control and manipulation the Knights Templar had over the population. The cult of Saint Nazario grew throughout 2011 and 2012. People credited him with miracles, with protecting their families, with bringing prosperity to their communities. The Knights Templar encouraged this worship, seeing it as a way to maintain loyalty and control. If people saw El Chayo as a saint, they'd be less likely to cooperate with authorities or support rival cartels. Here's something most people don't know about the Knights Templar. They weren't really a drug cartel, at least not in the traditional sense. I mean, yeah, they moved drugs. They had connections with suppliers in South America and distributors in the United States. They controlled some trafficking routes through Michoacán. But that wasn't their main hustle, not by a long shot. It's estimated that over 85% of their funding came from extortion. Let that sink in. 85%. They were less of a drug cartel and more of a massive extortion racket that happened to also move some drugs on the side. They demanded protection money from everyone, and I mean everyone. Avocado growers, citrus farmers, mining operators, loggers, taxi drivers, nightclub owners, tortilla sellers, construction companies, fishermen, store owners, street vendors. If you had a business in Michoacán, you paid the Knights Templar their quota, their cut. The amounts varied depending on the size of your operation. A street vendor might pay a few hundred pesos a week. A large avocado farm might pay tens of thousands of pesos a month. Mining operations paid even more, sometimes millions of pesos. The Knights Templar had a whole accounting system to track who paid what and when. They justified it as a tax for keeping the peace. They'd tell business owners, "We're protecting you from other cartels. We're keeping Los Zetas out. We're maintaining order. This is just your contribution to security." But the peace they were keeping was just the absence of their own violence. Pay up and they leave you alone. Refuse, and things get ugly fast. Businesses would be burned. Owners would be kidnapped. Family members would disappear. The message was clear: pay or suffer. The extortion system was incredibly organized. The Knights Templar had collectors who'd make regular rounds, picking up payments from businesses on their route. They had enforcers who'd deal with anyone who refused to pay or fell behind. They had accountants who tracked everything, making sure the money flowed up to the leadership. It was like a parallel tax system, except this one was backed by violence instead of law. The Knights Templar weren't just extorting small businesses. They were running industrial-scale operations that showed just how sophisticated their criminal enterprise had become. Through mid-2014, they were smuggling illegally mined iron ore through Mexico's largest port, the port of Lázaro Cárdenas. We're talking tons of iron ore, massive shipments, shipped to China and other countries, generating millions of dollars in profit. Here's how it worked. The Knights Templar would take over mining operations in Michoacán, either by forcing the owners to work with them or by running their own illegal mines. They'd extract iron ore using cheap labor, often paying workers almost nothing. Then they'd transport the ore to the port using their own trucks and drivers. At the port, they had corrupt officials on their payroll who'd look the other way as the illegal ore was loaded onto ships bound for Asia. The scale of this operation was incredible. Reports suggest the Knights Templar were shipping hundreds of thousands of tons of iron ore, worth tens of millions of dollars. They controlled entire supply chains, from the mines to the trucks to the ports to the ships. It was organized crime on a corporate level with logistics, accounting, and international trade connections. But it wasn't just iron ore. The Knights Templar also controlled illegal logging operations, cutting down protected forests and selling the timber. They extorted lime growers, taking a cut of every shipment. They controlled the avocado trade, which is huge in Michoacán. Avocados are sometimes called green gold because they're so valuable, and the Knights Templar wanted their share of every avocado that left the state. But let's not forget, beneath all the codes and rituals and business operations, the Knights Templar were brutal. The violence was constant and terrifying. Local women described convoys of Knights Templar trucks rolling through their towns, covered in bullet holes, sometimes with bloody handprints on the sides. These weren't just intimidation tactics. These were the aftermath of real battles, real violence, real death. One farmer described his daily commute in a way that shows just how insane life had become in Michoacán. Every day in just a few kilometers, I passed through 3 checkpoints. First, the Knights Templar searching cars, then the army, and after that, the Vigilante groups. The Vigilantes and the cartel checkpoint were the worst, armed to the teeth like Rambo and high on marijuana. Imagine that being your normal day. You wake up, have breakfast, and then drive to work, knowing you'll pass through 3 armed checkpoints, any one of which could be the place you die. You'd have to have your papers ready, your story straight, your face neutral. Show too much fear, and they might think you're hiding something. Show too much confidence, and they might think you're disrespecting them. It was a daily psychological torture that thousands of people in Michoacán lived through. The Knights Templar had checkpoints throughout the state, controlling who could move where. They'd stop cars, search them, question the occupants. Sometimes they were looking for rivals. Sometimes they were looking for goods they could steal. Sometimes they were just asserting their power, reminding everyone who was really in charge. And if they found someone they didn't like, someone who'd refused to pay, someone who'd cooperated with authorities, that person would disappear. The disappearances were constant. Families would wake up to find their son, their father, their brother gone. Sometimes bodies would turn up later, dumped on roadsides or in mass graves. Sometimes people just vanished forever, leaving families in agonizing uncertainty. The Knights Templar used this terror to maintain control, to keep people compliant, to make sure everyone understood the consequences of resistance. But the Knights Templar made a critical mistake. They got greedy. They got arrogant. They started believing their own propaganda, thinking they really were untouchable knights rather than criminals who'd gotten lucky. And they pushed the people of Michoacán too far. On February 24, 2013, something incredible happened that would mark the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. Groups of armed vigilantes, regular citizens with hunting rifles and shotguns, simultaneously took control of two towns, La Ruana and Tepalcatepec. These weren't soldiers or police. These were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, mechanics, regular people who'd had enough. They announced themselves as the new providers of public security. No more Knights Templar, no more extortion, no more terror. One of the leaders was a man named Hipólito Mora, a lime farmer who'd watched his community suffer for years under Knights Templar control. Mora wasn't a warrior or a revolutionary. He was just a guy who'd reached his breaking point. His family had been extorted, his friends had been killed, his town had been terrorized, and he decided that enough was enough. Mora rallied a crowd in the town square of La Ruana. He gave a speech that basically said, "We're taking our town back. Who's with me?" The response was overwhelming. Dozens of men, then hundreds, grabbed whatever weapons they had. Hunting rifles, shotguns, old pistols, even machetes. They weren't well armed or well trained, but they were determined. With shotguns and hunting rifles in hand, the vigilantes set off to search for Templars. They moved through the town, checking houses, searching buildings, looking for any Knights Templar members or collaborators. And here's the crazy part. They took La Ruana without firing a single shot. The Knights Templar heard about the uprising and fled. These so-called warriors, these knights, who preached about fighting and dying for their cause, ran away from farmers with hunting rifles. The symbolism was powerful. The mighty Knights Templar, with their military-grade weapons and their tough guy image, had been chased out of town by regular citizens. It showed that the emperor had no clothes, that the Knights Templar's power was based on fear and intimidation rather than actual strength. And once that fear was broken, once people realized they could fight back, everything changed. At first, people in Michoacán actually supported the Knights Templar. They believed the promises, protection from Los Zetas, safety for their families, a better life. The Knights Templar had positioned themselves as the lesser evil, the cartel that had rules and morals. And for a brief moment, some people bought it. But the Knights Templar quickly became exactly what they claimed to fight against. They extorted, they kidnapped, they murdered, they raped. The code they'd written, the principles they'd preached, turned out to be complete lies. They were just another cartel, maybe even worse because they'd pretended to be something better. It got so bad that people described it as semi-slavery. You couldn't run a business without paying them. You couldn't travel without their permission. Your daughters weren't safe from their advances. Your sons could be forced to work for them. Every aspect of life was controlled by the Knights Templar. They decided who could operate, who could travel, who could live. Young women were particularly vulnerable. There were reports of Knights Templar members forcing themselves on women, taking them as girlfriends, threatening families who tried to protect their daughters. The code said to respect women and children, but the reality was very different. The hypocrisy was staggering. When the vigilantes started rising up in 2013, the Knights Templar tried to backpedal. They sent polite letters to businessmen saying their voluntary contributions were no longer required. They tried to dial back the extortion, to ease the pressure, to win back public support. Some letters even apologized for excesses committed by members who'd violated the code. Too little, too late. The people had made their choice. They'd seen through the lies. They'd suffered too much to be fooled by a few polite letters. The uprising in La Ruana and Tepalcatepec wasn't an isolated incident. It was the spark that lit a fire across Michoacán. What started as a small uprising in two towns became a movement that would shake Mexico. The auto defenses, the self-defense groups, rallied some 20,000 armed fighters to their cause. 20,000. Think about that number. That's not a protest. That's not a riot. That's an army. An army of farmers, shopkeepers, doctors, taxi drivers, regular people who'd had enough. Throughout 2013, they defeated Knights Templar forces in pitched battles across Michoacan. These weren't just skirmishes or standoffs. These were real battles with hundreds of fighters on each side, lasting hours with casualties on both sides. The Vigilantes would advance on a town, the Knights Templar would try to defend it, and gunfire would echo through the streets. By December 2013, the Vigilantes had taken control of 47 out of Michoacan's 113 municipalities. That's nearly half the state. The Vigilantes advanced into towns, villages, and ranches, shooting cartel operatives, destroying narco symbols, and declaring communities liberated. They'd roll into a town in convoys of pickup trucks, armed men standing in the beds, and announce that the Knights Templar were no longer in charge. The speed of the Vigilante advance was shocking. Town after town fell to the auto defenses. The Knights Templar, who'd seemed so powerful just months before, were collapsing. Their members were fleeing, surrendering, or switching sides. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. As the Vigilantes pushed forward, they didn't just fight the Knights Templar. They destroyed their mythology. They smashed shrines to Nazario Moreno, unearthing statues decorated in gold and diamonds. These weren't simple altars. Some of the statues were life-sized, covered in precious metals and jewels worth thousands of dollars. The Vigilantes would drag them into town squares and destroy them in front of crowds, symbolically killing St. Nazario. They took over the homes of Knights Templar leaders, mansions with luxury swimming pools and bars, and showed the people the hypocrisy. These protectors of the poor were living like kings, while the people they claimed to protect lived in shacks. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One Knights Templar leader's house had a pool shaped like a guitar, a full bar with imported liquor, and bedrooms bigger than most people's entire homes. The Vigilantes would open these houses to the public, letting people walk through and see how the Knights Templar leadership really lived. It was powerful propaganda. People could see with their own eyes that the code was a lie, that the Knights Templar were just criminals enriching themselves while everyone else suffered. The Mexican government's response to the Vigilantes was complicated and often contradictory. At first, they tried to shut them down. After the Vigilantes rose up in 2013, the army arrested 51 members for possession of illegal weapons. The government's position was that vigilante justice was illegal, that only the state had the authority to use force, that these armed groups were dangerous regardless of their intentions. But the vigilante movement defied the arrests and kept growing. More people joined. More towns rose up. The movement had momentum that couldn't be stopped by a few arrests. Public opinion was largely on the side of the Vigilantes. People across Mexico were watching and cheering, seeing the auto defenses as heroes standing up to cartels that the government couldn't or wouldn't stop. Eventually, the government realized they couldn't stop the Vigilantes, and maybe didn't want to. The auto defenses were doing what the government had failed to do for years, actually defeating the Knights Templar. When the Vigilantes gained the upper hand against the Knights Templar, the government formed an alliance with them. Security forces and Vigilantes moved together against the cartel. It was an unofficial partnership, but it worked. Army units would coordinate with vigilante groups, sharing intelligence and planning joint operations. The government would provide heavier weapons and tactical support. The Vigilantes would provide local knowledge and manpower. Together, they were far more effective than either could be alone. The Knights Templar were being squeezed from all sides with nowhere left to run. On the morning of March 9, 2014, Mexican military forces led an operation outside the town of Tumbiscatio in western Michoacan. Their target was Nazario Moreno, El Chayo, the supposedly dead founder of the Knights Templar who'd been hiding in the mountains for over 3 years. Intelligence had finally pinpointed his location, and the military moved in with overwhelming force. This time, there was a shootout, a real one. El Chayo and his guards fought back, exchanging fire with soldiers for hours. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mountains. This time, there was a body. When the shooting stopped, soldiers found El Chayo dead, killed in the firefight. This time, they did fingerprint tests to confirm it was really him. They took photos. They documented everything. They weren't going to make the same mistake twice. Vigilantes and soldiers had finally closed in on Moreno's mountain hideouts, cornering him on a highland ranch where he'd been hiding. El Chayo, the man who dressed as God, the man people prayed to as a saint, was dead. For real this time. Photos and fingerprints confirmed it, which was embarrassing for former President Calderon, who'd claimed to kill him back in 2010 and celebrated it as a major victory. The death of El Chayo was a massive blow to the Knights Templar. He was their spiritual leader, their founder, their prophet. His writings guided their ideology. His legend gave them legitimacy. And now, he was gone, truly gone, and everyone knew it. But the Knights Templars' problems were just beginning. Just weeks after El Chayo's death, the Knights Templar lost another top leader. Enrique El Quique Plancarte, their second-in-command, was killed in March 2014. The circumstances of his death are disputed. Some reports say he was killed by the military. Others say he was killed by rivals. Either way, he was dead. Two top leaders dead in the span of weeks. The Knights Templars' leadership was decimated, and the man left standing, La Tuta, was now the most wanted man in Mexico. In 2014, La Tuta gave an interview to Channel 4 News that's absolutely surreal to watch. This guy, one of Mexico's most wanted criminals, sitting down for a TV interview like he's some kind of celebrity or politician. The journalist met him at a secret location, surrounded by armed guards, and La Tuta talked openly about his life and his organization. He admitted he was a criminal. He knew he'd eventually pay for his crimes. He wasn't delusional about that, but he said he wouldn't give himself up. He'd fight to the death. He positioned himself as a man of principle, someone who'd chosen this path and would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. La Tuta fashioned himself as a benevolent outlaw, breaking laws but giving generously to the poor. He talked about how the Knights Templar helped communities, how they built schools and churches, how they were better than the government. He was still trying to sell the myth, still trying to control the narrative, even as his organization crumbled around him. He regularly appeared on radio frequencies, haranguing troops or phoning into local TV or radio stations. He'd call into news programs and give impromptu interviews, explaining the Knights Templars' position, criticizing the government, defending his actions. He was playing a media game, trying to control the narrative even as the walls closed in. It was a desperate attempt to maintain relevance and power through public relations. By early 2015, La Tuta was on the run, hiding in caves and safe houses across Michoacán. The military was closing in. The vigilantes were hunting him. Former allies were turning on him. Federal police were using intelligence and surveillance to track his movements, monitoring his communications, following his associates, slowly tightening the net. And then, his girlfriend made a mistake. She ordered a chocolate cake for his 49th birthday. A chocolate cake. It seems like such a small thing, such an innocent gesture, but in the world of fugitives and manhunts, small mistakes are fatal. The order raised suspicion. Authorities were monitoring bakeries, deliveries, anything that could lead them to La Tuta. They'd put out word to businesses to report any unusual orders, especially for celebrations. The cake led them to a cave near Morelia where La Tuta had been hiding. After months of intelligence work, they had him. They knew where he was, who was with him, what his security looked like. They planned the raid carefully, making sure he couldn't escape. Early in the morning on February 27, 2015, federal police raided a house in Morelia, the capital of Michoacán. Inside was Servando La Tuta Gomez Martinez, the last major leader of the Knights Templar. No shots were fired. He was taken without a fight. The man who said he'd fight to the death surrendered quietly when faced with overwhelming force. La Tuta was frog-marched in front of media cameras, his head shoved down by masked federal police officers grabbing the scruff of his neck. The images were broadcast across Mexico and around the world. The mighty La Tuta, the man who'd taunted authorities for years, who'd given interviews and made speeches, was now just another prisoner being led away in handcuffs. They led him to a helicopter to be flown to prison. The schoolteacher turned cartel boss was done. With La Tuta captured, the Knights Templar had no clear leadership. The organization that had once controlled an entire state was now leaderless, fragmented, and collapsing. In June 2017, one of the last alleged leaders, Ignacio Renteria Andrade, alias El Cenizo, was arrested by Mexican security forces in Michoacán. The organization was falling apart, splintering into smaller groups, losing territory and influence. As of September 2017, the Knights Templar Cartel effectively ceased to exist as a unified organization. Their leader, Pablo El 500 Toscano Padilla, and his lieutenant Ezequiel El Cheques Castaneda were reportedly killed by remnants of La Nueva Familia Michoacana organization. The same organization the Knights Templar had splintered from in 2011 came back and finished them off. Poetic, in a way. The cycle of cartel violence had come full circle. By 2020, the Knights Templar and other sub-factions were still active across southern Mexico, but they were badly fragmented. They'd splintered into smaller groups like Los Viagras, with no clear leader and no unified structure. These remnants still engaged in extortion and violence, but they were nothing like the powerful organization that had ruled Michoacán just years before. The cult was dead. The empire was gone. All that remained were scattered remnants fighting over scraps. In June 2019, La Tuta was sentenced to 55 years in jail for the kidnapping of a businessman in 2011. 55 years. For a man in his 50s, that's essentially a life sentence. He'll die in prison, barring some extraordinary circumstance. But the story doesn't end there. On August 12, 2025, Servando Gomez Martinez was extradited to the United States as part of a deal where Mexico sent 26 high-ranking cartel figures wanted by U.S. authorities. La Tuta, the man who used tarot cards to decide people's fates, now faces American justice. His final chapter is being written in a U.S. courtroom, where he faces additional charges related to drug trafficking and organized crime. The Knights Templar Cartel was the de facto ruler of Michoacán from late 2010 until spring 2014. Through the use of a powerful narrative, medieval knights, religious codes, protection of the people, they were able to supplant both rival cartels and legitimate government authorities. They became Mexico's first true narco warlords, controlling not just drug routes but entire economies and populations. But their downfall was equally spectacular. The Vigilantes proved themselves as a significant third force in Mexico's drug war. They showed that powerful cartels can be vulnerable when ordinary citizens rise up. Farmers with hunting rifles defeated knights with AK-47s. A chocolate birthday cake brought down a cartel boss who thought he was untouchable. From their birth in the ashes of La Familia in 2011 to their complete dissolution in 2017, the Knights Templar Cartel lasted just 6 years. 6 years of terror, 6 years of extortion, 6 years of pretending to be something they weren't. And in the end, they were brought down by their own brutal hypocrisy, angry farmers, and a piece of chocolate cake. The Knights Templar claimed they were protectors, warriors, noble defenders of the people. But when the people actually stood up, the knights ran away. And that's the most satisfying part of all. The myth they'd built so carefully, the image they'd crafted so deliberately, crumbled in the face of real courage from real people. The Knights Templar Cartel rose from the ashes of La Familia Michoacana, built a cult-like empire on lies and violence, and fell harder than almost any cartel in Mexican history. They dressed like medieval knights, but ran like cowards when real people fought back. Subscribe to Inform Secreto to continue exploring the hidden stories behind power. Real stories told unfiltered. Because what you don't see also controls the world. See you soon.